Imagine a football match with no referee, no painted lines, no goals, and absolutely no limit on how many people can play. It is one entire village battling another. Hundreds of people chase an inflated pig's bladder through narrow streets, rushing rivers, muddy fields, and stretches of farmland. The match does not end after 90 minutes. It can drag on for hours, sometimes consuming an entire day. Feet are crushed, bones are broken, and every so often, someone never makes it home. For centuries, this violent spectacle was football. Today, more than 4 billion people follow the sport, making it, by an enormous margin, one of the most watched things humanity has ever created. Yet for most of its long history, kings did not celebrate football. They repeatedly tried to outlaw it. There were no grand stadiums, no referees carrying whistles, and no clock counting down exactly 90 minutes. There was only a roughly made ball and a restless crowd prepared to do almost anything to reach it. And somehow, from that storm of disorder, the game capable of bringing the entire planet to a standstill was born. But there is one crucial detail that most people have never heard. Football was not invented in England, and it did not originally emerge as a harmless game. The first known people who played something resembling it were not searching for entertainment. They were preparing themselves for war. To uncover the sport's true beginnings, we must travel more than 2,000 years into the past, all the way to ancient China. There, people played a game known as Cuju, a name that literally translates as kick the ball. The objective was to drive a ball through a small opening suspended high above the ground, using any part of the body except the hands. It already sounds remarkably familiar, doesn't it? But Cuju did not begin as a pleasant way to pass the afternoon. The earliest surviving descriptions portray it as a form of military training designed to sharpen soldiers' agility, improve their balance, and build strength in their legs. FIFA officially recognizes Cuju as the oldest known form of football supported by written historical evidence. In other words, football was not born on a carefully trimmed English field. Its first heartbeat came from inside a Chinese military camp. Over time, however, Cuju transformed into something surprisingly sophisticated and almost modern. During the Song dynasty, roughly 1,000 years ago, China already had professional clubs, dedicated stadiums, and celebrated players who earned money for their performances. Crowds admired these athletes much like supporters worship modern football stars today. It was essentially a professional league operating nearly a millennium before anything comparable appeared in Europe. Even the inflatable ball, that seemingly ordinary piece of equipment we barely notice today, was developed by the Chinese. And this is where a fascinating pattern begins to appear across human history. Similar ideas emerged independently in distant corners of the world, almost as if the same spark had ignited in several places at once. Japan had kemari, a gentler and more ceremonial game. The Greeks played episkiros, while the Romans developed harpastum. Across Mesoamerica, people competed in ritual ball games where the consequences could sometimes become deadly. These civilizations did not simply copy one another. Give human beings a ball, a pair of feet, and enough open space, and sooner or later they will invent a way to compete with it. But the closest ancestor of the football we recognize today was neither graceful nor civilized. It was violent, unpredictable, and often frighteningly dangerous. Across medieval Europe, particularly in England, communities played what historians now describe as mob football. The game had almost no consistent rules, An entire village could face the neighboring village in a battle that looked more like a riot than a sporting event. Historical accounts describe matches involving more than 100 players on each side. The ball was still commonly made from an inflated pig's bladder, rough and misshapen compared with the perfectly engineered footballs used today. Goals could stand several miles apart and might be marked by nothing more than a distant tree, a bridge, or an old windmill. Once the game began, almost anything was considered acceptable if it helped move the ball toward the target. Players pushed, tackled, kicked, and crashed into one another as crowds poured through streets, fields, and rivers like a human avalanche. Broken bones were an ordinary part of the spectacle. Deaths were not nearly as uncommon as modern fans might want to imagine. That relentless violence was one of the main reasons English kings repeatedly tried to destroy the game. In 1314, King Edward II officially banned football within the City of London. His decree complained about the deafening commotion in the streets and the many evils supposedly caused by these chaotic matches. Anyone caught playing could be sent directly to prison. But that royal order contains a fascinating historical detail. It includes one of the earliest known written appearances of the word football in the English language. In other words, one of the first times the game was officially named in writing was in a document attempting to outlaw it. However, violence and public disorder were not the Crown's only concerns. There was another reason behind the ban, and it was far more strategic. Football was pulling young men away from something the kingdom considered essential: archery practice. In an age when skilled longbowmen could determine the outcome of entire battles, every man chasing a ball was a man who was not preparing to defend the country. From the Crown's perspective, football was no longer simply a noisy street disturbance. It had begun to look almost like a threat to national security, and the decree issued in 1314 was far from an isolated attempt to suppress the sport. Between 1314 and 1667, more than 30 separate laws were introduced in England to prohibit football. Think about what that truly means. For more than 3 centuries, kings, officials, and lawmakers tried repeatedly to erase the game from everyday life, and every single generation failed. People ignored the warnings, accepted the risks, and continued playing whenever and wherever they could. Football had become nearly impossible to stop, but it was still ruled by chaos. Every village, school, and region followed its own version of the game. Some allowed players to carry the ball, while others insisted it could only be kicked. Certain matches permitted brutal physical contact that would look criminal on a modern football pitch. 2 teams could not even begin a match without first arguing about what actions were allowed and which rules everyone was expected to follow. Football was spreading, but it still had no shared language. Then, in 1863, a small gathering in London set in motion the moment that would transform the sport forever. Inside a London tavern, a group of men met with an idea that sounded simple but was quietly revolutionary. They wanted to create one universal set of rules that every team could understand and follow. That meeting led to the birth of the Football Association, the first organization established to formally define the laws of the game. For the first time, football appeared ready to leave its lawless past behind. But instead of ending in unity, the historic meeting erupted into a bitter division. 2 questions had divided the men in that London tavern, and neither side was willing to surrender. Should players be allowed to kick an opponent in the legs? And should they be permitted to pick up the ball and run while carrying it in their hands? One group wanted to preserve the rougher and more physical version of the game, where handling the ball remained perfectly legal. The opposing group believed football should be played almost entirely with the feet. Neither side was prepared to compromise. Eventually, the men who supported carrying the ball stood up, abandoned the discussion, and walked out of the room. And that disagreement produced one of the most important twists in the entire history of sports. That evening, inside a single London tavern, one sport did not emerge. Two completely different sports were born. The men who remained behind continued shaping the game that would eventually become modern soccer. Those who walked away followed another path that ultimately helped create rugby. The reason players today cannot simply grab a soccer ball with their hands is not some timeless or natural law of sports. It is the result of an argument that one side lost in a tavern more than 150 years ago. Yet that seemingly ordinary disagreement became the key that unlocked football's future. Once the rules were standardized, the sport could finally travel beyond the communities that had created their own local versions. Before 1863, almost every village, school, and region played according to a different set of customs. Afterward, football possessed something it had never truly had before: a shared language. The same game could now be understood and played in London, Buenos Aires, or a crowded port somewhere along the African coast. British sailors introduced it in distant harbors. Merchants carried it along international trade routes. Factory workers, engineers, and immigrants brought it into rapidly expanding cities across the world. And almost everywhere football arrived, it spread like fire racing through dry grass. But why did this particular sport conquer the planet while so many others remained limited to certain countries or social classes? The answer is almost uncomfortably simple. Football demands practically nothing from the people who want to play it. You do not need horses, expensive rackets, protective equipment, or even a real field. You only need something roughly round and enough open space to move. The ball can be made from old cloth, tied plastic bags, or anything else that can roll across the ground. A child playing in a narrow alley can place two stones several feet apart and instantly create a goal. That child is playing the same fundamental game performed by millionaire athletes inside stadiums holding 100,000 screaming fans. The surroundings may be different, but the basic challenge remains untouched. One ball must be controlled, protected, and driven past the other side. That simplicity allowed football to cross borders that politics, wealth, and language often could not. It could be played in wealthy neighborhoods and forgotten villages. It belonged equally to crowded cities, isolated islands, dusty streets, refugee camps, beaches, and carefully maintained stadiums. A person did not need money or social status to understand it. They only needed to see the ball moving. That is how football became the world's game. And that is why, at its core, it may be the most democratic sport humanity has ever created. The poorest child and the richest superstar are still chasing the same ball and trying to solve the same ancient problem. But bringing order to chaos never destroys it completely. It only forces that chaos to hide beneath the surface. Under football's carefully written rules, the ancient energy of the medieval mob is still very much alive. You can see it when rival supporters clash outside stadiums. You can feel it when the stands transform into tribal territory and an ordinary match begins to resemble a battlefield. It appears in the anger people carry when their team loses, as though the defeat happened not to a group of players, but to them personally. Scarves, Colors, chants, and club badges become symbols of identity. For 90 minutes, thousands of strangers begin thinking and moving like a single living creature. And sometimes, the emotions surrounding the game spill far beyond the boundaries of the field. In 1969, a series of World Cup qualifying matches between El Salvador and Honduras intensified tensions that were already tearing the two countries apart. Those matches did not create the political crisis by themselves, but they helped ignite an atmosphere that contributed to a real armed conflict. The episode became known around the world as the Football War. It served as a brutal reminder that football has never entirely stopped being a controlled version of one group battling another. Modern stadiums may look nothing like the muddy fields of medieval England. The grass is perfectly maintained, the lines are measured with precision, and cameras capture every movement from dozens of angles. Millions of dollars flow through the sport, while enormous audiences watch from almost every corner of the planet. Yet if you look closely enough, you can still see the medieval village hiding behind the modern stadium. Beneath the technology, sponsorships, flashing screens, and polished spectacle, the same ancient scene remains. There are still two groups of human beings. There is still one ball between them, and there is still the timeless desire to defeat the other side without completely destroying it. The original chaos was never erased. Humanity simply built rules around it and gave it a place where it could survive safely. That may be the true reason football continues to feel so powerful. It is not merely something we watch. It touches something ancient inside us that existed long before stadiums, professional clubs, or television broadcasts. So the next time you see children playing in the street, stop and watch them for a moment. They may use two rocks as goalposts and chase a worn-out ball that barely rolls straight. They may argue about whether the ball crossed an imaginary line or whether someone committed a foul. No referee taught them what to do. No coach explained why the game should matter. And yet, they understand it almost instinctively. Those children are not creating anything new. They are repeating a human ritual that has survived for more than 2,000 years. It is the same basic movement once practiced by soldiers in ancient China. It is the same restless competition that pulled medieval English villages into streets, rivers, and fields. The children may not know why chasing a ball feels so natural to them, but now you do.